Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
Whose idea was this?
I don't know. I'm sure it was yours.
I think it was yours. Actually, Stephanie and I preached together for the first time after being married, I don't know, maybe 10 years, on her last Sunday at Trinity Church in Reno. And it was so great. We enjoyed it so much. We've been talking about it ever since, and I don't know, maybe that was part of it.
I think that was part of it. We've had all these wonderful conversations over the past 5 years, but there aren't generally quite so many other people listening in.
Right. I wanted to bring your attention back to the entrance hymn that we sang together just a few minutes ago. And we were talking about this. We were talking about our sermon now for 3 weeks, this joint sermon that we're about to do with you. And as we came together this morning, we both realized that the entrance hymn, the first verse of the entrance hymn, could be a little, we do the summary of God's law every week now. This could be the summary of our sermon. And as Richard Adams knows, who was on the search committee when I was selected, I do not know how to sing, so I will be reading this. Will you come and follow me, if I but call your name? Will you go where you don't know and never be the same? Will you let my love be shown? Will you let my name be known? Will you let my life be grown in you and you in me? It's really the summary of our sermon. We could sit down
is.
right
I think
now.
we could just sit down.
Right, but we won't. So, how do you encounter this initial? What's your initial encounter with the gospel?
Well, it really strikes me that for the second week in a row, one of the main characters in our gospel lesson is a tax collector. And Beth was preaching last week and shared with us that tax collectors were not exactly the most popular people. They gained their wealth generally through defrauding others. And so this is not just a tax collector, but a chief tax collector. And he's short in stature on top of that. So he's just not this popular guy. I love this gospel lesson. I love the scene that it creates, because here's this chief tax collector who knows he's really incredibly unpopular, but he so desperately wants to encounter Jesus, probably not for the first time. Probably this is one of several encounters. He so desperately wants to encounter Jesus that he climbs a tree so that he can see him. He doesn't try to manipulate some meeting through his power and his influence and his wealth. He's willing to make himself kind of ridiculous to encounter Jesus. That's how much he longs for this encounter. I love that.
Yeah. But we don't know. We don't exactly know, do we, whether he knows him or not. Mm-hmm. I'm struck by the words, he was trying to see who Jesus was. So that leaves me with a little, like the jury, just so little doubt. Does he really know?
Yeah.
But Jesus knows him, calls him by name. So here is this huge crowd, and he calls Jesus. He calls Zacchaeus by his name.
Yeah.
That's profound.
It's amazing, and the delight in that, to be recognized by one that you so long to encounter, and not just recognized, but then to have Jesus say, I want to come to your home. Hurry up, get down out of that tree. To bring this encounter to this whole different level. Yeah.
Sonya and I wanted to talk about names, right? Mm-hmm. We want to talk about the profound nature of our name with the intimacy that God knows us and how God knows us. Mm-hmm. And I think the way we agreed to start this sermon is to talk about our names. Mm-hmm. And this intuition that we both have, that we grow into our names over the course of our life. We get these names, but then our names and our life in God unfolds and becomes more deeply woven together. Mm-hmm. So why don't you start and tell us a little bit about your names?
Sure. So my first name, Sonya, there was this grand argument between my parents about calling me Sandra or Sonya, and my mom insisted on Sonya because it sounded like a song to her. And she was really, really delighted to have a baby girl. And there's a way in which that name has been a wonderful gift because it's always reminded me of my family's joy in welcoming me into this world. But there's also a way in which it has been kind of confining because it wasn't just that I was a song, I was expected to be a happy song, always. And that was the role I was supposed to play in my family. And when I didn't play that role, other people reacted not so kindly. So it's been kind of a lifetime of growing into what is the song that I sing. It's not always a happy song, but it is in my own authentic voice as I grow and mature in Christ. My middle name is Joan. I was named in part after St. Joan of Arc, who's this awesome, fiery, fierce, mystical woman. And I was also named after a nurse, Joan, who saved my Uncle Alan's life when he was a child. So the nurse was Joan. My Uncle Alan became a priest. My mom was named after the nurse Joan, who saved his life, as she became a nurse, and then I'm the one becoming the priest. Which, let me tell you, is not what my Roman Catholic family had in mind. They're like, we take that name back. And then my last name, Reichel, is sort of a loaded name for me. It's German. It has something to do with Reich, with power and empire. And it's a name also that I've had to really grow into because I grew up with a father who was very abusive and who used his power in very hurtful ways. And for a big part of my life, I really didn't want this last name because I associated it with him and with an exercise of power that was really harmful. But again, by God's grace, this is kind of the story of my life, is this story of coming into authenticity. By God's grace, I came to understand how power could be exercised in helpful ways. And that a kingdom can be more like the kingdom of God than the kingdom my father tried to create. So I've grown into that name as well, I think. How about you?
Yeah, I think I've told you before in various sermons over the last 4 years about my birth. I was the fifth, the youngest of five. And when I was born, it was the first time in 5 years that my mother had given birth to a child. She was 48 years old. And that was 1956, not 2015. So different kind of time in medicine. And the birth was a traumatic birth. It was a traumatic birth, and there's so many stories that go with the birth. But the most important story for this morning is the naming. And the two names go together, Joseph and Francis. Joseph, so long story short, I almost died in birth, and my mother almost died in birth. And so the priest was rushed from our parish, Our Lady of Refuge Parish in the Bronx, New York City. He was called from the hospital and came immediately to the delivery room and gave me an emergency baptism. I was baptized 3 weeks later at the church, but I was emergency baptism. And the priest who came to give me the emergency baptism was Father Joseph Kozlowski. I was named after Father Joseph Kozlowski. And I grew up with this, well, first of all, I grew up in this very religious Roman Catholic family. We said the rosary every night and on and on and on. You know, devotion to the Sacred Heart. When people are going out to party on New Year's Eve, we were gathered around saying prayers as a family. That gives you a sense of how religious we were. But I grew up with this sense of being expected to be a priest. And like you, perhaps a little disappointment that it wasn't a Roman Catholic priest, Episcopal priest. Francis, my name Francis, was actually after Mother Frances Cabrini. So here I am, a little boy, all in blue, and my mother picked Francis because the nurse, the emergency nurse in the delivery room, had a medal. She used to carry medals in her pocket, medals, religious medals. And she, when my life was at risk, she took out a medal of Francis Cabrini, and she pinned it on my gown in the delivery room. So that's Francis with an E. Something odd happened along the way that I'm still working out with my family and asking questions about. So this unfolding of the story, right? The unfolding of our name. You think I would just know about, what Francis is, and it would be closed and done, and we know about it, and we just remember it. But it keeps on unfolding because only in the last few years did it dawn on me that my baptismal certificate says Francis with an I.
Mm.
Well, my mother, apparently, because I didn't have this conversation with my mother, she had already passed away by the time I had this realization, but my sister Kathy said, well, Mom was embarrassed to call you Francis with an E and put it on your baptismal certificate because you're a boy, and she thought you'd be teased. Right? But I have this history now with Francis as an E and Francis as an I.
Mm-hmm.
Can I continue one more?
Yes.
Minute? So that's an important story about how not just the names, but the unfolding of the names in my history. So my mother anticipated that I'd be teased. And in actuality, I was teased. Even though she went to all this effort to change the E to the I, as a child, I was bullied in school. I was picked upon constantly. I was too tall. Other kids thought I was too tall. I was too thin. I had a tremor since I was a baby. So here was I had this tall kid, skinny, thin, trembling. Wasn't very good in athletics, so, I was this odd duck. And a lot of kids don't like odd ducks. And I was really the victim of a lot of bullying. And so isn't it interesting that my mother anticipated that I would be teased, but not because of the E in Francis, but because that was there.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that extraordinary how our names just kind of convey an expectation, but then we really don't know how those names, what's in the name? I could have been called Peter Joseph, but Joseph Francis has had a profound impact. Yeah.
It's amazing to me that there's a kind of prophetic quality to the names that we're given, but not in a sense that our lives are predetermined because of them. They just influence us in a way.
Yeah.
And yet we also are the ones that make meaning out of those names.
Right. And so, you and I are very conscious about this sharing of names at a time of stewardship. This is our stewardship campaign.
That stewardship had to fit into this somewhere.
Yes, but I think it's a natural placement. You're like smiling at me, like.
I'm smiling because I think our gospel lesson gives us a natural placement of it.
Why don't you tell us how you think?
We're just thinking of how the gospel lesson kind of wraps up that, here's Zacchaeus who has been called by name and asked if Jesus could enter into his home and be with him. And Zacchaeus, aware of all the grumbling around him, says, wait a minute, if I've defrauded anyone, I'll pay them back fourfold, and I'll give half of my possessions to the poor. And I hear that as being really sincere. I don't think Zacchaeus was just trying to go, I'm not what you think I am. I think he was just so full of gratitude for this encounter with Jesus that he responded with generosity. There's a way in which he finally heard his name and wanted to live into it more abundantly.
Yeah. For me, in congregations, at stewardship time, there's a real tendency to give there can be a risk and a tendency to give to protect what we have. To give to protect what we have. We've built up St. Francis over these last almost 60 years now, and we're going to give in order that it may be sustained into the next generation. And that's fair. But I think this gospel calls us to a deeper place. I think this gospel calls us to a place to realize that our names are kind of iconic, or a metaphor that leads us to realize that it doesn't belong to us, even though it's our name. We're like unfolding in God's grace that God gives to us, and we become something that we didn't expect. The family expected me to be a Roman Catholic priest. I became an Episcopal priest. The family expected me to be ambivalent about the E or the I. Actually, the E and the I brings me great joy, a sense of solidarity with queer brothers and sisters. My Stephanie and I, when we got married, we got married before a civil justice, and then went to the church to have our marriage blessed in solidarity with our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. Because they couldn't in the church, we did. And so this naming had this profound impact much later on. But that's about me. I want to go back to us as a church. This unfolding of our names. How about the unfolding of St. Francis Church and who we are? And to allow ourselves to kind of walk the unknown. Where are we being led? Where is God? Where is Jesus calling St. Francis Church? You know, St. Francis Church is up in the tree or on the balcony looking down, nervous and anxious about the future. And Jesus is saying, St. Francis Church, come down. Can you see that?
Yes.
Wouldn't that be amazing? You know, but I think that's what's happening. That we're being called into a place that we don't know exactly what it looks like, but God is there. What makes this a profound story, every story in the gospel, is this presence of God. Right? How God is present in our lives. And it just keeps, the story just, in my own life and yours, the story just keeps getting better and better. I mean, I love my names, and I love the place that my names have brought me. True for you.
Yes.
And St. Francis Church, the places you've been, but the places you don't yet expect to go, and that God is calling us into that.
Today, salvation has come to this house. Today, salvation has come to this house. What does that mean for St. Francis as we hear our names called by Christ and we're invited with every breath into a deeper and deeper and deeper relationship? And we respond to that in new ways. I'm still remembering your sermon from a few weeks ago, speaking of the gifts that we receive and how they're different in different seasons of our lives. And I think that can be said of salvation in a way. Salvation is not just a one-time event in our lives. Salvation comes and comes again and comes again. And how is that unfolding? What is our response now as a congregation to hearing our names called and knowing ourselves to be held with such love?
I remember, this was not in our plan, but that's the joy of preaching without notes. Is I remember sitting in my office a couple of months ago with Pastor from Christian Community, Pastor Sanford, and we were just back from Glasgow, and the priests and clergy in Christian Community Church throughout the world do a portion of their training in Germany. And so Sanford had done a lot of his graduate work in Germany. And he said to me that one morning, a couple of weeks before after we came back from Glasgow, in the middle of a meeting with myself and Keith, just getting started, we used to have these little tracts, theological tracts, and he said, "Do you know about Stephanie's name?" And I was like, "No." And he said, "Stephanie in German means joy." And so here is this joyful woman, even through fourth stage cancer, who has encountered her illness with joy. And so she's lived into her name in a way that she could never have anticipated. All her life has been about joy in ministry, but in a profound way at this time now in her life. And that's striking. It's just one more example of how we become the name that we've been given. And in this becoming that the name we are given, we're called to become like Jesus, right? So if you go back to, around Christmas time, after the birth of Jesus and before we go into the hidden life, there's this really short line in the gospel about Jesus going away so that he may grow in stature. And that's how I see our names, that we're constantly growing in the stature of our names.
Yes.
Yeah. We're going to stop there.
That seems like a good place to stop.
And I want you to think about your names. I want you to think about where we are as a church. And I want you to go to that deep place. There's one more thing you didn't say.
Ooh, what did I leave out?
You left out the piece about the intimacy of naming. And you wrote to me last night and you told me this little snippet from Africa.
Oh, that's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the problem with not having notes. Almost lost that little gem, but it really closes our sermon in a beautiful way. Could you
You'll
share
have to
that?
help me remember what I wrote. I'm reading a book that's called Of Water and the Spirit, written by a man called Malademo Somé, and he's from a Dagara tribe in West Africa. And in their tribe, naming is really prophetic business, that the name a child is given gives the child almost a compass to follow for their entire lives. It's in their name they know their mission and their purpose. So that naming is powerful.
Yeah. So we came at it from one way of sharing about the history of our names, how we've grown into our names, but that really kind of closes it beautifully, because we both have this experience of talking about our names and the places that we've been drawn to as a result of our names. But that story tells me that it wasn't just by chance, it was by purpose.
Absolutely. The God who knit us in our mother's wombs has a hand in every part of our lives, including in our naming.
Right. And in the naming of St. Francis and who we are and the prophetic call that we have as we were and as we will be. God bless you.
Amen.